Boston's merchants had a problem. They refused to call crime. Guarding ships, warehouses, and cargo was eating their profits alive. So they did something clever. They pushed that expense outward, onto the public, and called the result a police department. That part is not speculation. Boston's own records preserve it, and the paper trail changes the story from the first sentence. For nearly 2 centuries, America had no modern police force at all. No departments, no stations, no uniformed officers waiting on a phone call. What existed instead was the night watch. Boston started in 1636, and other cities copied the same fragile system decades later. These men were supposed to walk the streets from dusk to dawn with a rattle and a painted staff. Their job was simple on paper, shaky in practice. They watched for fires, listened for noise, and called out when trouble appeared. But mostly, they were there to raise an alarm. A rattle, a shout, and a crowd rushing in. That was the system. It did not prevent disorder so much as announce it, and when the watch failed, it failed badly. Men drank on duty, slept through their rounds, and vanished when they were needed most. In some towns, citizens made them shout the hour just to prove they were awake. That tells you everything about the trust involved. In other colonies, night watch duty was a punishment. If you broke a minor law, your sentence could be a night on the streets. So the man guarding the neighborhood might also be a man paying for his own wrongdoing. That is not public safety. That is coercion. The constables were no better. They were paid by the warrant, not by the hour, which meant their income rose when conflict rose. That meant nobody measured whether a neighborhood was safer. Nobody counted prevented crimes. The only thing that mattered was the fee. On the south, the logic was even darker. In 1704, Carolina created the first official slave patrols, and other colonies quickly followed. These patrols were armed, mounted, and authorized to stop, search, and punish enslaved people without written permission. Their mission was control. By 1837, Charleston's slave patrol had more than 100 officers. It was one of the largest organized police forces in America. Not a watch, not a neighborhood service, a state-backed force built to stop freedom from moving too far, too fast. The official story says city growth forced change. New York swelled, riots spread, immigrants arrived, and the old night watch cracked under pressure. That part is true. But change did not answer the deeper question. Who was the new system actually built to serve? Boston answered first. In 1838, merchants were already paying private guards for ships and warehouses, so the city simply renamed the bill. The first daytime police force had only 6 officers. It was public funding, but the purpose was still protecting commerce, not the public. A system built on hidden costs rarely stays small. Once the city paid, the department grew, and the structure became harder to question. That is the pattern you keep seeing. Private expense becomes public duty, and public duty becomes a machine that answers upward. By the time the modern department arrived, the motive was already buried in plain sight. The question was never about crime first. In Boston, the first permanent daytime force did not appear in a moment of public alarm. It appeared after merchants realized private guards were eating into their profits. They were already paying armed protection at the waterfront. The real breakthrough was learning how to convert that private expense into a public bill. That change mattered because Boston's records preserve the switch. What looks like reform in hindsight began as a cleaner way to spread the cost of security. And that logic did not stay in Boston. Once one city proved the model worked, other urban leaders began looking at public order the same way. Before that, American cities relied on a patchwork of night watchmen, constables, and part-time warden forces. None of it resembled a modern department. In practice, those men worked at night, carried simple equipment, and relied on neighbors to respond. The system was local, improvised, and constantly breaking down. The complaint was not that crime was unknown. It was that no one trusted the men assigned to prevent it, and no one trusted how they were chosen. Even the constables were often paid by fees, not salaries. That meant the system rewarded enforcement after the fact, not prevention before it happened. A man who made money by serving warrants had every reason to find more warrants. Public safety was never the only incentive built into the job. And in the South, a different system was already doing something even darker. It was not responding to street disorder at all, but controlling enslaved people. These patrols searched for passes, weapons, and any sign of resistance. Their purpose was never ordinary crime control. It was to protect slave property and enforce slave order. By the early 19th century, those patrols had become organized, state-backed terror. They built a template for policing that America later expanded and professionalized. The public story later emphasized urban growth and rising disorder. Those pressures were real, but they do not explain who gained power when the new departments arrived. Who was actually being protected? Boston's merchants had already answered that question in practice. If security could be recast as a civic service, the service moved from business ledgers to taxpayers. That is why the earliest daytime officers were tied so closely to business districts and waterfront traffic. They were protecting commerce first and calling it order. That old arrangement was not hidden in the archives by accident. The records are plain, but the popular story leaves out the financial motive entirely. And once the departments existed, they could grow quickly. Their expansion was tied less to a national plan than to local elites who wanted dependable control. That control was not abstract. It showed up in who got appointed, who stayed employed, and whose interests the department quietly protected. So when people ask why the police were created, the answer is not one single cause. It is a chain of financial interests, slave control, and urban management. And that chain kept its shape when it crossed from watch systems into departments. The names changed, but the logic of control stayed intact. That is why the earliest departments were never neutral machines. They were built inside the economic and political systems that demanded them. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. Crime was useful as justification, but it was never the original engine behind the institution. Because once a public institution is funded to protect property, it will always drift toward protecting property first. That shift was visible from the beginning. That means the founding question was never, how do we stop crime? It was, how do we make a private burden look like public necessity? That question still hangs over the institutions that followed. The names changed, but the old financial architecture never fully disappeared. The question that should have haunted Boston was never solved in the open. Once merchants realized private guards were draining their profits, the answer came from the city ledger. Before any uniformed police force existed, cities relied on constables, watchmen, and neighborhood levies. It looked like order, but in practice it was fragmented, unpaid, and deeply unreliable. The real turning point came when cities stopped asking, how do we keep order? And started asking, how do we make order pay for itself? That shift mattered, because early patrol systems were never designed with citizen service in mind. They were improvised labor, assembled from whoever could be compelled, spared, or cheaply replaced. In many towns, watch duty was punishment. A man sentenced for a minor offense might spend the night pretending to guard the same streets he had already violated. The constable's world was even stranger. Payment often depended on warrants served, seizures made, or arrests processed, not on whether a street stayed peaceful. That created a brutal incentive. The more trouble a constable processed, the more money flowed in, which meant disorder could quietly become a source of income. The South solved a different problem in a far darker way. Plantation societies needed a force that could move faster than rumor, escape, or resistance. These slave patrols were not informal mobs. They were authorized, regularized, and armed, with written powers to stop, search, and brutalize enslaved people without hesitation. Their purpose was explicit. They searched for weapons, passes, and anything that might make an enslaved person harder to control. By the 1830s, Charleston's patrol system had grown into one of the largest organized forces in America. It was bigger, more disciplined, and more feared than any watch night. The important point is not just brutality, it is structure. These patrols show that America already knew how to build a public force around private power. Northern reform arrived later, but it did not arrive in a vacuum. As cities swelled with dock workers, immigrants, and factory labor, elites wanted predictability, not just safety. That is where the real expansion happened. Police forces grew fastest where labor had to be disciplined. Streets had to stay open, and commerce could not afford interruption. So the force that emerged in the North borrowed the logic of earlier systems. It was meant to channel unrest, not eliminate the conditions producing it. And once a city depends on that logic, reform becomes almost cosmetic. You can change badges, patrol routes, or uniforms without changing who the institution answers to. That is why the first true departments were so important. They did not simply appear to fight crime. They appeared where property, trade, and city growth demanded control. The city of Boston is the clearest example. When daytime police were introduced, they were tiny in number and attached directly to municipal authority, not to public demand. At the same time, the department was already tied to commercial interests by design. Guarding docks, cargo, and market routes meant protecting the city's money first. The most revealing detail is what happened next. Once business interests found a public machine, they no longer needed to pay directly. Tax money did the work for them. Even public resistance could not fully stop the model. Once a department existed, it could be expanded, standardized, and defended as necessary, no matter who benefited most. That is the deeper pattern in the record. The institution did not evolve from a clean civic ideal. It accumulated power by solving elite problems with public money. Even the language of public safety came later, after the machinery was already built. First came control. Then came the vocabulary used to justify it. That is why the question still matters. If a system was built to serve commerce first, every later reform has to wrestle with that original blueprint. The departments changed names, expanded budgets, and promised order, but the old arrangement never truly vanished, and the city still carries its first financial design. In Boston, the first daytime police force did not begin with a crime wave. It began with merchants quietly replacing private guards with a public bill. Their problem was simple. Paying private men to watch docks and warehouses cost money, and public money looked far more convenient. That calculation mattered more than any public safety slogan. Once the city paid, the same protection could be called civilization instead of expense. That first blueprint spread because it solved a financial problem, not a criminal one. And once the model worked in Boston, other cities watched closely. By the 1840s, northern cities were growing too fast for the old watch system. Crowded streets, factories, and docks demanded a stronger hand. The old watchmen were never built for that scale. They were part-time, poorly paid, and expected to stand in for a system that barely existed. In practice, they answered to whoever controlled the ward, the payroll, or the local appointment. That meant politics shaped the force before law ever did. Some men were even chosen as punishment, not promotion. A night patrol could be another sentence attached to a minor offense. That meant the man guarding a neighborhood might be the same man a court had already failed. Security and punishment were beginning to blur together, and there was another layer of corruption. Wealthy men could simply hire substitutes, often from the same criminal world the watch was meant to restrain. So the city's protection could be performed by men with records, debts, or grudges. The institution was already learning how to survive by bending. Down south, the logic was even harsher. Slave patrols became organized armed forces designed to stop movement, search bodies, and enforce plantation order. Virginia and the Carolinas formalized those patrols early, and by the 18th century every slave state had some version of the same machinery. These were not random mobs. They were formal, state-backed patrols with riders, weapons, and authority to terrorize on command. By the 1830s, Charleston's slave patrol had grown into one of the largest organized forces in America. That scale mattered, because it proved the model could be expanded. And it proved something else, too. America's earliest professional policing did not emerge from neutral public service, but from control of labor and movement. In the North, that control took a cleaner form. As cities industrialized, the police budget became a way to shift private security costs onto taxpayers. Boston's daytime force was small at first, but it marked the moment that merchants no longer paid directly for protection. The city did it for them. That arrangement expanded quickly. By 1854, Boston had a full police department, and its mission was described as order, property, and commercial stability. The real pressure point was labor unrest. Immigrant workers were organizing, and the same cities that profited from them wanted a force to contain them. That is why the pattern spread. The force was not designed only to catch thieves. It was designed to manage crowds, strikes, and unrest. Every major department that followed inherited that same shape. Different uniforms, different city seals, but the same relationship between money and control. This is the part the polished story leaves out. The police did not appear because crime suddenly demanded them. They appeared because power wanted them. The first budgets were sold as protection, but the deeper system was always about who paid and who benefited. That original deal never really disappeared, and that is why the question still lingers over every department built on that inheritance. If the public never chose the blueprint, who was it really built to serve? By the time Boston's merchants paid for their own guards, the real trick was already underway: turn private protection into a public expense. Once that accounting move worked, a new language covered it up. What had been a bill became a department, and the public was expected not to notice. That is why the origin story matters. The first American police systems were not born from crime waves alone, but from who was paying the bill. For 2 centuries, American cities relied on night watchmen, constables, and ad hoc patrols. They were patched together, underpaid, and easy to manipulate. Their job was not professional crime prevention. It was to make noise, summon neighbors, and hope enough bodies answered the alarm. The system was so weak that some towns made watch duty a punishment. If you broke the law, your sentence might be a night on patrol. And in many places, wealthy men simply bought substitutes. The result was predictable. The streets were watched by drunks, offenders, and hired stand-ins. The constables were no better. They were often paid by warrant, which meant income followed arrests, not safety. That created a perverse incentive. The more trouble they found, the more they earned, while no one measured whether trouble had actually been prevented. Then the South built something harsher still. Slave patrols were organized, armed, and authorized to hunt people who had no legal freedom at all. Their patrols checked papers, searched bodies, and enforced terror through law. By the 1830s, Charleston had the largest organized force in America. So the earliest professional American enforcement was not built to stop theft or assault. It was built to control labor, movement, and black freedom. North and South looked different on the surface, but both systems served power. One protected property, the other protected slavery, and neither began with the public at the center. That pattern became clearer in Boston, where merchants realized private guards were expensive. A city department let them spread that cost onto everyone else. So Boston launched 6 publicly funded day police. They were not born from popular demand. They were born from a business calculation dressed as reform. Soon after, larger departments followed, especially in cities crowded with immigrants and workers. The stated reason was disorder, but the deeper need was control. When labor-organized police expanded, when strikes spread, departments grew stronger. The public force became a shield for the people paying the most taxes and taking the most profit. And once police became permanent, they were no longer just a reaction to danger. They became a standing institution for managing who could move, work, and resist. That does not mean every officer was corrupt or that every department operated the same way. It means the architecture was built around interests, not innocence. That is why the inheritance still matters today. If the original blueprint rewarded property, patronage, and control, those habits do not vanish on their own. A department can change uniforms, slogans, and procedures, but if its funding, loyalty, and purpose were designed at the start, the old logic survives in new clothes. That is the uncomfortable truth hidden under the official story. America did not first create police to fight crime. It created them to manage people and expenses. And once you see that, the timeline stops looking accidental. What looked like isolated decisions begins to feel like one long pattern of authority being built before anyone asked what it was built on. The same kind of quiet assumption appears again and again, that land, records, and institutions can be handed off without anyone checking the ground beneath them. But every time that happens, something hidden is preserved along with the paperwork. That is what makes the larger history so unsettling, because the public is rarely told what was left unexamined until the consequences are already in place. If a system can be created on top of an unasked question, what else has been sold, renamed, or inherited without anyone looking down first?